we invite our keynote speakers, Professor Bassin and Professor IEPAS2016 to speak.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. As we just said, Oscar and I have a bit of a history, and he's been inviting me for a couple of years. I've been unable to come, but I was really delighted this year finally to be able to make it, and I certainly won't be the last time. So it's very good to be here. What I want to talk about is Eurasianism today in Russia, Neo-Eurasianism, it's sometimes called, against the background of its historical origins and its evolution across the 20th century. And I want to approach this in terms of my own background, which is in history, or the history of ideas. I'm a professor of history of ideas in Sweden. For me, the history of ideas studies the constant playoff, or dialectic you might say, of continuity and change. How ideologies evolve in response to evolving historical and political contexts, and to get some sense of what this scenario means. The development of Eurasianism from its origins in the early 20s down to the Neo-Eurasianism of our own day is a particularly rich and fascinating, I would say, example of this process. And the challenge for me as a historian is to trace it. Now, I should emphasize to begin with that this question of continuity that I'm interested in, this question of fidelity to within an ideological tradition, is important not only to the historians of ideas, to academic nerds, you might say like myself, who have an interest with this. It has a much deeper, and I would argue a functional even, significance in the political sense. Because one way that an ideology seeks to establish its legitimacy is precisely through its claims of fidelity to its founding principles. We could even talk about something of a mystique of doctrinal origins, which I think is very important. An example of this, if I can just for one moment reach to a completely different sort of geographical arena, and this is an American political discourse. And if you're familiar with it, and I suspect some of you at least are, you'll know that the trope of the founding fathers in the United States political discourse is constantly invoked. Constant references to the original formulators of the principles, the political principles that the American Republic was founded on in the late 18th century. And is constantly invoked today to illustrate the importance precisely not of those principles, but rather this claim to legitimacy and credibility in the present day because of being faithful and true to this tradition. Now, Neo-Eurasianism, leaving the American arena now and shifting to Eurasia, Neo-Eurasianism, I think, provides an excellent second example of this process. Perhaps you can remember, if you think back, some of you I think in this room at least can, to the 1990s, the immediate sort of post-Soviet period, where Eurasianism began. Those of us who have always been interested in Eurasianism noticed this right away. It began not where it is today, in the political mainstream, but on the extremist fringe of radical conservative politics in the Yeltsin regime, the extremist anti-Yeltsin fringe. And among its proponents was one in particular who emerged very quickly, and this is an ideologue by the name of Alexander Dugin, who some of you, or most of you probably heard about. Now from the outset, an essential aspect of Dugin's promotional strategy was an ambitious publication project. And he set up very quickly, he set up his own publishing house, his own publisher, and he published prominently among the texts that he published were the founding texts of classical Eurasianism, the texts of the originators, the founding fathers of Eurasianism from the interwar period, the 1920s and the 1930s. Texts which had been unknown, which were long lost, and which then went back into circulation. And this proved to be an extremely effective way of his establishing his guardianship of this legacy to enhance the credibility and the legitimacy of his own Neo-Eurasianist project of the 1990s. My comments today will consider this question of legacy. This is what I want to look at. I'll try to keep it short. I'm more interested in opening questions than I am in answering them, really just to set up the problem and to identify some aspects of the playoff between continuity and transformation. Now, any discussion of post-Soviet Neo-Eurasianism has to begin with a disclaimer, and that is the fact, again, aware of this, that there's not one Eurasianism on offer today. There are many Eurasianisms. It's a very awkward English formulation, but there's no other way to pluralize that particular concept. Just to name a few, in Russia, you have Dugin's Neo-Eurasianism, you have Neo-Eurasianism of Lev Gumilyov, for example, one of the sort of inspirers of Neo-Eurasianism. I just finished a book about him. Putin now, Vladimir Putin, has his own sort of official Eurasianism. If you move outside of Russia, of course, Kazakhstan has a version of Eurasianism, several of them. Nazarbayev and others in Tatarstan, Shaimiev and Limanov, and so on. All of these are different, and one can go on and name many others. I'm not going to try to explain the differences today, simply want to mention that you have a plurality here. They are there, and I will be mentioning some of these as I move through my comments. Now, I want to begin by discussing continuities, and I'll discuss two essential continuities in Eurasianism between the original period and the Eurasianism of today, which are quite fundamental, I think, and important. The first of these is the vision of Eurasia as a cohesive, multinational community of fraternal peoples. The belief that the great masses of the population, both of the former empire, the former Russian Empire, this is in the 1920s, and of the former Soviet Union today, in a very similar way, shared deep affinities and deep connections that had been created through centuries of accumulated experience of cohabitation of these common geographical expanses. And these affinities survived, in both cases, the process of geopolitical disintegration. In 1917, disintegration, and in 1991, disintegration. The underlying coherence and unity of these different groups remained undiminished through this experience of geopolitical trauma, or as Vladimir Putin put it, evocatively geopolitical catastrophe. So in this regard, Eurasianism was then and remains today a civilizational discourse. It viewed Russia as a civilization, a Weltkultur in German, famously described in the 20th century in the works of Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, and others. And indeed, Spengler's first volume, his famous Untergang des Abendlandes, The Decline of the West, was published in 1918, right at the end of World War I, and the first Eurasianist, classical Eurasianist manifesto, which is a brochure by Nikolai Blagojevskoy, entitled Европа и человечество, Europe and Mankind, was published in 1921, 3 years after. And it was a response precisely to Spengler. And he developed there these Spenglerian civilizational ideas applied to Russia. Civilizational discourse came back in fashion at the end of the Cold War. You have a particularly influential statement of it, quite relevant, I would argue, for Neo-Eurasianism in Russia, with Samuel Huntington's Civilizations, the Clash of Civilizations. And once again, we find Neo-Eurasianism embracing this perspective. You have very strong resonances of Huntington in Russian Neo-Eurasianism. Gumilyov, in particular, who was one of the inspirers, possibly you might say the chief contemporary inspirer of Neo-Eurasianism, was intensely Huntingtonian and civilizational in this sense, in his own work. So what this means is that for both classical as well as Neo-Eurasianism, the unity of the Eurasian peoples is based not on ethnic or ethno-national affinities, but rather on nebulous civilizational empathies that are shared among many nations and national groups that bind them together into a single entity. Common social and cultural values, historical experiences, and so on. What the Germans call a Schicksalsgemeinschaft, a polyethnic community of destiny. Following directly upon this point is a second continuity, I would argue, between the two periods. And this is that in both cases, the fact of civilizational optionist, the fact that they formed a civilizational community, dictated and still dictates the primary overriding geopolitical dynamic for the country, and that is the imperative for geopolitical unity. Classical Eurasianism took shape, and most immediately in the early 1920s, as a reaction to the territorial fragmentation of the Russian imperial state in the period after the revolution of 1917. The imperial periphery of the Romanov Empire began to break away from the corpus of the old imperial structure. This was in the Baltics, in the West, Ukraine, Crimea, along the Volga, in Central Asia, Russian Turkestan, and the Caucasus. Everywhere there were separatist movements, many of them successful, at least briefly successful, moving for national autonomy and indeed independence. The classical Eurasians, Trubetskoy and his colleagues, never opposed the revolution as such. They accepted and endorsed the destruction of the Romanov regime. But their first demand, in the face of that, for the post-revolutionary and the post-imperial state, was that it had to reassemble the traditional spaces of Russian nationhood into a single geopolitical corpus. They accepted the political destruction of the empire, but not the geopolitical destruction of the empire. Resurrect Russia now in a new form, not as the Soviet Union, but rather as Россия Евразия, as Russia Eurasia, Velikaya Nedelимая. Neo-Eurasianism, post-1991, in an almost uncanny manner, has emerged in similar circumstances. That is to say, the territorial fragmentation of the Russian, now of course Russian Soviet state. And on the basis of a similar vision of многонаrodная общность, or multinational commonality, Neo-Eurasianism began with a similar, identical I should say, demand, that is to say, to reconnect the territories of Eurasian civilization. A reenactment in the early 1990s of precisely the same calculation that we saw in the post-revolutionary period, to accept the political destruction of the regime and to think, yes, now we can move on to something new and better, but to reject and to attempt to reverse the geopolitical fragmentation of the state that went along with it. So there are two fundamental elements here of continuity which I think are very important, but they're counterbalanced by significant differences between the periods as well, and I will briefly try to identify three. The first point here relates to matters that are internal to Eurasian society. As I already pointed out, for both classical as well as Neo-Eurasianism, Eurasian civilization is a collection of fraternal peoples, and the geopolitical cohesion of them is essential. But it's based on respect. It's a cohesion of a single entity, but based on respect for ethno-cultural differences. So the attitude here, and again, here the classical Eurasians welcomed the destruction of the empire, because their attitude was that the entity had to exist not based on the old traditional colonialist domination of the empire by the great Russian peoples, but a post-colonialist perspective. And again, the period here, 1918, 1919, Versailles, this is all very significant here for Eurasianism, a post-colonialist vision of equally enfranchised nations, a brotherhood of nations that would cohere into a single entity. The fact remained, of course, that the Russians were the biggest, they were the strongest, they had this ancient legacy of being a dominant and controlling power, and the challenge was always how to manage the balance of power between them, between the Russians and everybody else. Here, classical Eurasianism, though, was very, I think, emphatic and very distinctive. It rejected the empire. It saw itself as a post-imperial. Again, the resonance here with the zeitgeist at the time of decolonization is extremely important for understanding classical Eurasianism. And they were determined to overcome this colonial legacy in Russia, Eurasia, of Russian domination. They never resolved the tension, and you always had this idea of Russia was an equal to the others, but of course first among equals. But the principle, at least, was incredibly important. And in 1927, Nikolai Trubetskoy, the author of the manifesto I just mentioned, wrote an extraordinary essay. To me it seems extraordinary, and it's entitled Общеевразийский национализм, Pan-Eurasian Nationalism. And in it he insisted that Russians could no longer, and he spelled this out very powerfully in his text, Russians could no longer think of themselves as a dominating nationality. From now on, the Russians, the great Russians, were just one among many, one of the Eurasian peoples, just like all the others. And in conclusion, he called on the Russians to surrender the very principle of Russian nationalism. They shouldn't talk any longer. There should be no mention any longer of Ruski nationalism. The concept should disappear and be subsumed instead by the title of his essay, Общеевразийский национализм, Pan-Eurasian nationalism. I don't think the point could have been made under the circumstances much more strongly. If we look at Neo-Eurasianism today, however, we see a very different situation. There's still a tension in it that I described. You still have an endorsement of the principle of equality, the condemnation of the evils of imperial domination, of national chauvinism, and so on. But in fact, the positions and the substance of the discourse today are very different. Because a great majority of Russian nationalist ideologues who support Neo-Eurasianism clearly support it as a project precisely for re-establishing the dominant or leading position of the Russians. Re-establishing the dominant and leading position that they claim had been lost in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, which had followed an artificial program of enfranchisement of non-Russian nationalities, what my colleague Terry Martin calls an affirmative action empire. Russian leadership, great Russian, ethno-Russian leadership had been lost, and now Neo-Eurasianism is a way to reclaim this. They describe Russia, ethnic Russia, great Russia, as the terms such as государство образующий народ. Again, if you're familiar with the discourse today, you'll recognize these terms right away. Russia is the state-forming nationality. The empire, the state, was created by the Russians. They are dominant. Russia is the stержень. This was a word I didn't know. I had to find out what this meant. This means backbone, actually. Russia is the backbone of Russia, Eurasia. And is charged with the ведущий роль, the leading role of organizing the Eurasian community. One can even find, of course we find people like Dugin speaking in these terms, but one can even find Vladimir Putin speaking in these terms, more modulated, more diplomatic perhaps than the others, but if you read carefully Dugin's pronouncements now over the past few years, you'll see very clearly a Russocentric undertone in them, as he has come to embrace the Eurasianist project. Paradoxically, in Kazakhstan and in Tatarstan, where Neo-Eurasianism, a form of it, a rather different form of it, is officially endorsed on official levels, is often resisted on more popular levels precisely for the reason that I'm talking about, precisely because it's seen as an ideological foil for Russian nationalists, chauvinists like Dugin to advance a program of Russian aggrandizement. The final 2 points, these differences with the in the legacies, relate to Eurasia's relations with the external world. Classical Eurasianism was a strongly isolationist doctrine. They called themselves continentalists. They developed this continentalist sort of geopolitical ideology. This was Pyotr Savitsky at the time of the 1920s, who was a very gifted geographer, developed this, and others picked up on it. Geographically, he argued, Russia was continental space. And the geographical Russia, this great kind of Eurasia continent or subcontinent, and the geographical fact of continentality was an essential aspect of Russia's identity. It was cut off from the oceans, and because of this, Russia could never compete as a maritime power. It could not compete militarily, it could not compete economically. This had been, so the Eurasianists argued, for those interested in history, they argued this was Peter the Great's great mistake. Those of you who know Peter the Great from the early 18th century, and his sort of first and most important, as he saw it, move in westernizing, the great westernizing era, Europeanizing, the great westernization of Russia began with the establishment of a Russian navy, which had never existed before, but of course he had experiences with the navies in Holland and elsewhere, and he then established the Russian nation. This had been a mistake. This pretension to somehow have a maritime presence was a mistake. The Eurasians argued that Russia's political and economic development needed to reflect this objective geopolitical reality, which meant that they should prioritize the economic and political integration and development of its internal spaces, and the goal should become self-sufficiency and isolation, effectively, from the outside world. The model that the classical Eurasianists were working with was a model of economic and political autarky. And it had powerful resonances at the time with other parts of interwar Europe, where similar visions, autarkic visions of isolationist and internal development were being advocated. In Germany, of course, very famously, the concept of Mittel Europa, which was a very influential one for the Eurasianists, but also in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Socialism in a single country reflected many of the same assumptions. It resonated in very, very deep ways with what the Eurasianists were saying, for all the differences. One notable corollary of this isolationist perspective, this isolationist stance, was that the principle of messianism, which was always a very deep principle in Russian nationalism, Russian understanding of itself, was actually very modulated. And almost, you can see it, but there are only traces of it. In classical Eurasianism. Neo-Eurasianism, that is, the situation today. Neo-Eurasianism also promotes the internal consolidation and integration of the post-Soviet spaces. But at the same time, it is externally directed. This external, what you might call outreach, engagements, are an integral part of the Neo-Eurasianist project. This is very clear, for example, in the thinking behind the Eurasian Economic Union, the development that many of the papers here we're going to be talking about. Already in the 1990s, it goes back to the origins of this thinking, which of course was not from Russia at all, but it began as a Kazakh project of Nazarbayev. The vision there was explicit in the inspiration it drew from the European Union. And the connections there were they were spelled out, they were explicit, and it was not only a question of inspiration and sort of the EU as a model, but rather a prospect already at that time of proactive alignment with the EU, some sort of engagement with it. Now this openness and outreach, as I call it, to the West, to the EU, was repeated once again in a very similar language when Putin made his very famous sort of endorsement statement for Eurasianism. Finally, the moment we've been waiting for, those of us watching this situation, the scene there, been waiting for this for a long time. And in 2011, in October, in the newspapers, Viestia, Putin published a long article spelling out his Eurasianist vision. And here as well, this vision of Putin underscored the synergies between Eurasia and the West and the EU. And he even described a vision of a unified economic space. He uses this language stretching from Dublin, which is the westernmost part of the European Union, all the way to Vladivostok. More recently, of course, Putin has developed Russia's built an elaborate outreach program emphasizing the other Eurasian direction, and that is the famous pivot toward Asia and his move toward China, which can be understood as part of the same project, the same grand project. All of this demonstrates the elasticity of the Eurasia concept today. It's no longer restricted to the post-Soviet space, to the space of Russian государственность or the Russian state life. It's much greater, it's more ambitious in the global arena that it embraces. There's nothing isolationist, no longer anything isolationist about it at all. And if we look in particular at the Neo-Eurasianist project of Alexander Dugin, we see an even more radical picture. Dugin loves geopolitics, as we all know. He endorses continentality. He republishes Savitsky. He gets very excited about these long theoretical tracts about Russia's essential continentality. But he interprets the imperatives extremely differently. Because rather than autarky and isolationism, which had been the conclusion that Savitsky came to, the Eurasians, not just him, the classical Eurasians came to in the 1920s and 30s, today, for Dugin, Russia's continentality points to the need for the opposite. The dramatic expansion of Russian authority. Dugin's geopolitical vision is not isolationist, it is aggrandizing, it is expansionist, it is imperial. You can see this immediately. You're reading his work, you don't have to read his work because he illustrates them generously with maps. And if you look at the maps where he tries to draw out, or sketch out the borders of Eurasia, you see that it's no longer limited. This is gone, this familiar geopolitical space of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Union. He extends this dramatically outward in the way that he presents it to the west, where he moves the boundaries of Eurasia into Europe, and he also enacts a pivot to Asia with vengeance through extending Russian influence to the south and the southeast, across Central Asia and further, Iran and even further. For Dugin, Russia's Eurasian identity means that Russia has a natural right to press its sphere of influence and control ever farther outward in all of these directions. Unlike, finally, the classical Eurasians, in Dugin there is a strong element, unmistakable, of messianism. Something that I said was very muted. It didn't fit, really. It doesn't fit, interestingly, into the classical Eurasianist perspective. For Dugin, Russia's mission, Eurasia's mission, is to lead the world in resistance to the perfidious unipolarity of the American New World Order. And just to illustrate this, in 2002, Putin actually organized a formal political party called the Eurasianist Party. He wrote a series of documents, political documents establishing this. They were gathered together in one large collection, and the title he gave to that collection, Евразия как планета, Eurasia as the planet. This is meant half literally. A final point then, the last point in terms of the differences, is related to the point I've been making. And this is that the specific Eurasianist understanding of the West. What exactly is the West? What is Russia's relationship to it? Very important point, we all understand, for Eurasianism. Now, on this point, classical Eurasianism was very faithful to the historical legacy out of which it developed. That is, it was very faithful to the Russian nationalist legacy of the 19th century Russian nationalism, pan-Slavism, people, famous articulators, Dostoevsky, Nikolai Dostoevsky, Konstantin Leontiev, all of whom embraced the notion of Russia and the West, or differentiated Russia and the West, as separate cultural historical types. That's Dostoevsky's phrase, separate civilizations, in other words. And indeed, they were not only separated by differences, they were actually confrontational. Because throughout history, the West had been Russia's hostile antithesis, its nemesis, and its principal threat. This threat from the West had always been the most fundamental condition of Russia's existence, and it always will be. This is classical Eurasianism, which we get, and this is simply an echo of what one can read in Spengler. You can read the same thing if you read Huntington today. If you read Lev Gumilyov, I talked about his Huntingtonian bias, very, very powerful, making these points, all in the legacy, the tradition of classical Eurasianism. But if we look at neo-Eurasianism today on these same questions, well, it's very ambivalent. It's very ambivalent. They can embrace anti-Westernism, of course, and it often does. But this is by no means the only option. And anti-Westernism, or the critique of the West, of the European West, is no longer necessarily a fixture of it. For this, we can take, once again, let's take a look at Vladimir Putin himself in his Eurasianist moods. Today, of course, well, after Crimea, after Ukraine, Novorossiya, all of these problems, his anti-Westernism is not in question. I'm not going to try to argue that. But if we listen to how he described, go back to the statement he made, very important statement in 2011, 5 years ago, not that long ago, still part of his current, one might say, part of the administration's third term, he said the following, quote, "As we developed the idea of a Eurasian Union, we proposed to the Europeans to think together about the creation of a harmonious community of economies, a zone of free trade, and even more advanced forms of integration." So, a very different, hardly belligerent, much more welcoming and seeking some sort of accommodation. We have an even more striking example of this if we look at the philosopher, our ideologue, Alexander Dugin, once again, who has completely reconceptualized the classical Eurasianist antipathy to the West. Because in his view, the principal enemy of Russia today is not Western Europe at all, the classical Europe and the classical West, an opponent of the original Eurasians. Rather, for Dugin, it is the Russia's enemy here, Russia's opponent, is the Atlanticist powers, Atlantism as he calls it. The Atlanticist powers, primarily the United States, but also their maritime allies, most prominently here, the UK. This shift or displacement of emphasis, or of locating the enemy across the Atlantic, the United States, serves to redefine the geographical sense of the West itself, because Eurasia, Western Europe ceases to be Russia's antithesis, an antitype against which Russia has defined itself, and instead becomes an intermediate zone between, well, what used to be the superpowers, and obviously still on that model of superpowers. Europe, the West, is weak. It is the subject, it's not an enemy, it's not a threat to Russia, it is weak, it itself is a subject of contestation from without. Effectively torn between Russia and the United States. He argues further that objectively, Western Europe shares Russia-Eurasia's natural interest in resisting American influence. And to the extent that Eurasia is prepared to recognize this objective commonality of interests with Eurasia, with Russia, it becomes Russia's natural geopolitical ally, quite literally a part of Eurasia. So, there is here a rapprochement with Europe in classical Eurasianism, which is an absolutely fundamental, I would argue, revision, not just of classical Eurasianism, but of the whole tradition of Russian nationalism and of this particular element in Russian understanding of itself and its position in the world. And indeed, the idea of Russia, Eurasia, and Europe sharing a civilizational challenge of resistance to maritime Atlanticism, to Americanism, is not really, I would argue, a Russian idea at all at the end of the day. Dugin is taking this from somewhere else. He's taking this from the ideology of the contemporary West European New Right, the conservatives, the extreme conservative movements over the last decades in Western Europe, which have been developed primarily by non-Russian theoreticians such as Jean Thiriart in Belgium during the Cold War, then continues to be developed by Alain de Benoit, the leader of the French New Right today. These are theoreticians, and one sees this today in active European politics. One sees this in the politics, for example, of the Le Pen family in France, with whom Dugin is very supportive. One sees it in the administration of Viktor Orban in Hungary and elsewhere as well. Driven in all cases by a visceral geopolitical anti-Americanism, and Dugin, the Russian Eurasianist, under the canopy of neo-Eurasianism, now embraces precisely this program, which establishes an extremely important point because it establishes the basis for an understanding, a pan-European, if you want to call it that, understanding, which is very important, and one sees this also in the policies of Vladimir Putin, who finances, for example, the Le Pens in France. Okay, I talked long enough. I think I'll come to an end here. I just wanted to offer some observations discussing aspects, elements of continuities and changes in Eurasianist thinking. As I said at the beginning, it's interesting for me as a historian of ideas and historian of ideologies to trace this uneven evolutionary process, but at the same time I believe quite strongly that the historical dimensions that I've illustrated today, briefly mentioned, are important for a fuller understanding of the more practical political significances of these ideas in Russia and Eurasia today, which is what the rest of the papers at the end of the conference will go on to talk about. Thank you very much.